The ocean is still smoking. A carrier deck tilts under scorched metal as crews stumble through burning fuel. Somewhere beyond the haze, a formation of American dive bombers falls from the sky like a single, silent decision. And here's the thing. Every man involved already knows this moment shouldn't be possible. Not with the odds. Not with the timing. If you held the enemy's secrets in your hand, would you risk everything to use them? Or stay silent and let thousands die? The bombs fall. The Pacific holds its breath. Midway didn't begin on the water. It began in a windowless room in Pearl Harbor, weeks before the first plane ever took off. Here's what most people forget. The battle wasn't won by ships, planes, or luck. It was won by a handful of analysts staring at fragments of numbers they weren't even supposed to understand. Japan believed its naval codes were unbreakable. They weren't. By early 1942, American cryptanalysts had chipped away at JN-25, the encrypted command system that guided the Imperial Japanese Navy. They didn't have all of it, but they had enough. Enough to see a pattern forming across thousands of intercepted messages. Enough to sense that Japan was building towards something decisive. What they didn't know was where the blow would fall. That was the danger. Because Japan still had the strongest carrier force on Earth. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, backed by veteran pilots who had crushed every enemy they'd faced. They moved like a single organism, striking fast, striking hard, striking first. And the United States? It was still recovering from December 7th, still burying its dead, still patching ships at Pearl Harbor. American naval power at the time wasn't measured in strength, it was measured in what it had left. The core of the American fleet was now 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, still limping from the Coral Sea. Yorktown needed months of repair. She was given 72 hours. That's the backdrop against which the codebreakers made their gamble. They suspected the target designated AF in Japan's encrypted traffic was Midway, a tiny atoll, barely a dot on the map, holding a runway, a fueling station, and not much else. But if Japan wanted to pull the American fleet out and destroy it, Midway made perfect sense. The problem? Washington wanted certainty. Guessing wasn't enough. Betting the entire Pacific Fleet on a hunch wasn't enough. So the codebreakers improvised a trap. They told Midway to broadcast an uncoded message. We're running low on fresh water. A day later, Japan transmitted a secure message. AF is short on water. That was the confirmation. That was the moment the war shifted. And the uncomfortable truth behind it. It was the same uncomfortable truth we uncovered in our episode on the codebreakers of Pearl Harbor. Wars are often decided long before the shooting starts. Now the Americans had something Japan couldn't imagine: knowledge. They knew when the attack would come, the first week of June. They knew where it would come from, northwest. They knew the size of the force, massive. They also knew something else, something subtle but critical. Japan expected the Americans to react slowly, to arrive late, to fight on Japan's terms. Instead, the U.S. Navy quietly sailed out days earlier, taking position northeast of Midway, hidden in the emptiness of the Pacific. But knowing the enemy's plan didn't erase the size of the threat. Japan's Navy wasn't just stronger, it was experienced. The pilots who would attack Midway had fought across Asia and the Pacific for years. They had muscle memory from a dozen victories. Their commanders assumed Midway would be just one more. And on paper, they had every reason to believe that. Japan's carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, was the most feared naval formation on Earth. Its doctrine was sharp, its coordination flawless, its confidence absolute. America's carriers? You could count their veteran pilots on one hand. Most were fresh from training, some with only a few months' experience. Their squadrons were under strength. Their torpedoes were unreliable. Their aircraft, Devastators and Wildcats, were slower, older, and outperformed by Japan's Zero fighters. This is where the miscalculations began to stack. Japan believed the Yorktown was sunk. It wasn't. Japan believed the American carriers would scatter after Coral Sea. They didn't. Japan believed Midway was vulnerable and blind. It wasn't. Not anymore. And even with all that intelligence in hand, the Americans still faced a brutal reality. They would have to hit Japan's carriers first. If Japan struck first, the battle and the Pacific was lost. So the American plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. Use Midway as bait. Let Japan open the battle. And then, in that narrow window when Japanese decks were rearming and refueling for a second strike, hit them. Every part of it depended on timing. Every mistake would cost minutes. And at Midway, minutes were everything. By the dawn of June 4th, the pieces were in motion. Patrols took off in the dark. American carriers held their positions. Midway's radar eyes scanned the sky. And somewhere beyond the horizon, 4 Japanese carriers were advancing in perfect formation, confident, composed, and carrying the weight of an empire behind them. Across the Pacific, no one could yet see how the next few hours would rewrite naval warfare forever. Midway is remembered as a single, decisive moment. But the truth is more layered. To understand how the tide turned, you need to see the battle from several angles: human, tactical, technological, and from inside the Japanese command itself. Each angle exposes a different pressure point, and together they show why this battle was never just a contest of ships. It was a collision of assumptions. Before the carriers ever engaged, Midway itself braced for impact. In the early morning, Marines and Navy personnel stationed on the atoll stood beside anti-aircraft guns dug into coral. They knew they were the first line, and realistically, the first casualties. They weren't elite aviators or hardened naval crews. They were mechanics, radio men, cooks, and ground staff who found themselves holding a position Japan believed would fall in a day. As the sun crept over the Pacific, the distant hum of engines turned into a roar. 90 Japanese aircraft descended toward Midway in perfect formation. For the defenders, this wasn't strategy, this was survival. Bombs tore into fuel storage tanks, runways, and gun emplacements. Smoke rose so thick it stained the morning sky. And yet, the defenders didn't break. They kept firing into the storm, their gun crews sweating and shaking as the shock waves rolled through the atoll. It didn't stop the attack, but it forced Japan to commit a second wave, and that decision would ripple into the rest of the battle. Here's what that means. The defenders of Midway, outgunned and nearly overrun, didn't win their fight, but they bought time, seconds, minutes, just enough to complicate Japan's perfect plan. Out on the ocean, the American carriers were operating in near silence. Their position was a gamble, a spot northeast of Midway where they hoped to ambush the Japanese fleet as it moved past the atoll. American scouts spotted the enemy first. That alone was extraordinary. Japan expected to find the American carriers much later. But here's where Midway becomes almost paradoxical. Even with perfect intelligence, American strike waves were a mess. Squadrons launched piecemeal, scattered by weather, poor communication, and the enormous distances involved. Some pilots never found the enemy. Others flew in circles over empty ocean. The torpedo squadrons launched attacks that were valiant but doomed, slow aircraft pushing straight into Zero fighters. From a tactical point of view, this should have been a disaster. But tactically flawed doesn't mean tactically useless. Those doomed torpedo runs did something far more valuable than sinking ships. They pulled every single Japanese fighter down to sea level. The sky above the carriers, for the first time all morning, was unguarded. This is the strange duality of Midway, strategic brilliance wrapped in tactical chaos. Now shift to the Japanese flagship Akagi, where Admiral Chuichi Nagumo faced a dilemma that would define the battle. After the first wave struck Midway, his pilots radioed back. The atoll was damaged, but still operational. They recommended a second attack. Nagumo agreed and ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed for a second land strike. At that exact moment, reconnaissance aircraft reported American ships nearby. What Nagumo needed now was clarity. What he had was contradiction. If the Americans were close, he needed his aircraft armed with anti-ship weapons. If they weren't, he needed to finish Midway with another land strike. Rearming the reserve would take precious time. Switching halfway through the process would take even longer. And he knew the Americans could be anywhere or nowhere. This is the point most documentaries rush past. Nagumo's hesitation wasn't weakness. It was the result of Japan's rigid doctrine. Carriers were not meant to change targets mid-operation, and the Kido Butai had never faced a surprise attack of its own. While Nagumo debated, the minutes slipped away, the same minutes Midway's defenders had bought with their lives. From Japan's perspective, the battle was under control. Their first strike on Midway was effective. Their carriers were intact, their pilots were ready, and they still believed the Americans were reacting too slowly to be a threat. Here's the blind spot. Japan didn't know its code was compromised. They didn't know the American carriers had already launched, and they didn't know that the torpedo squadrons drawing their fighters down to the waves were setting the stage for disaster. From the Japanese viewpoint, everything appeared orderly. Their decks were covered with fuel hoses, bombs, torpedoes, and aircraft in mid-rearmament. This wasn't sloppiness. It was the standard procedure for an experienced fleet preparing its next strike. But the combination of exposed decks, concentrated aircraft, and open fuel lines created the most vulnerable moment a carrier can have. The Americans didn't know this in detail. They didn't need to. They just had to arrive at the right moment. The U.S. Navy's dive bombers, the SBD Dauntless, were not glamorous aircraft. They weren't fast. They weren't sleek. They were reliable, stable, and deadly from above. And in that one window, that single moment when the clouds opened and the Japanese decks were full, reliability mattered more than speed. Here's what sets dive bombing apart. It compresses chaos into control. From thousands of feet, the pilot points the aircraft straight down, accepting the freefall, trusting the airframe, and aiming for a moving deck the size of a city block. The dauntless pilots trained for that precision. The Japanese Zeros, locked in a defensive frenzy at low altitude, were too far away to stop them. This is how angles converge. Midway's defenders bought time. Torpedo squadrons dragged fighters low. Nagumo's indecision kept Japanese decks exposed. And the dauntless pilots arrived at the exact wrong moment for Japan, and the exact right moment for history. And then everything changed. There's a weight in battle that never shows up in official reports. It sits in the cockpit, on the carrier deck, in the radio room. Midway was saturated with that invisible pressure, the kind that changes judgment long before anyone fires a shot. On the American side, the pressure was sharp and personal. Pilots knew they were flying into a superior force. Many launched with the quiet understanding that they wouldn't return. Torpedo Squadron 8, for example, took off knowing the odds were almost irredeemably stacked against them. They weren't naive. They were professionals reading a situation that didn't lie. But they went anyway, because hesitation meant the Japanese strike groups would reach their carriers first. On the Japanese side, the pressure was different, heavier, but hidden. Japan's early war victories had shaped a mindset. They were expected to dominate. The Kido Butai's reputation had become a psychological burden. Every operation had to match their past performance. Anything less felt like failure. This mindset is crucial. Japan hadn't planned for uncertainty. They hadn't practiced losing initiative. They hadn't prepared for an enemy who knew their playbook. So when the reports conflicted, when scout planes offered incomplete information, when Nagumo's logic bent under the strain, the invisible pressure cracked the rigid structure of Japan's doctrine. And the Pacific is merciless to hesitation. Midway wasn't decided by hours. It was decided by slivers of time. 5 minutes here, 7 minutes there. The smallest delays stacking into catastrophic results. Take the scout plane that spotted the American fleet. It launched late. By the time it delivered its report, the Americans had already committed their attack groups. Or take the rearming process aboard the Japanese carriers. Switching from land bombs to torpedoes wasn't just a matter of swapping ordnance. It required clearing the decks, removing unstable fuel lines, repositioning aircraft, recalibrating fuses, and resetting launch procedures. Each of those steps took minutes, and each minute added vulnerability. On the American side, timing worked the opposite way, through fragments of luck aligning with small, desperate decisions. Dave bomber squadrons that should have missed the target instead stumbled into the perfect attack vector after overshooting their rendezvous point. Cloud cover that should have concealed Japanese ships instead revealed them at the last possible moment. Midway's operational truth is simple. Japan's delays exposed their fleet. America's mistakes placed their bombers overhead at the perfect instant. That's not myth-making. That's how warfare works. Pressure turns seconds into destiny. It's easy to celebrate the victory at Midway. The destruction of 4 Japanese carriers changed the war. But underneath that outcome sits a moral weight the battle rarely acknowledges. American torpedo squadrons flew into near-certain death. Not heroism in a cinematic sense, but a cold, professional understanding that they were absorbing the punishment so someone else could land the decisive blow. Their sacrifice was not metaphorical. Entire squadrons were erased. Families received telegrams without explanations. Pilots died without firing a shot. On the Japanese side, the loss wasn't just strategic. Pilots who had trained for years, irreplaceable aviators with combat experience unmatched anywhere in the world, disappeared in minutes. Their loss hollowed Japan's naval air power in a way that could never be recovered. Every destroyed carrier took with it a generation of skill that Japan's wartime production couldn't rebuild. Midway wasn't just ships sinking. It was the evaporation of 2 nations' finest aviators in a span of hours. The moral question lingers. Was the intelligence gamble worth the human cost? Was Japan's confidence worth the lives of the men trapped on burning decks? War doesn't give satisfying answers. It only leaves consequences. Admiral Chester Nimitz anchored his entire Midway defense on a single principle: information beats strength. He didn't have the larger fleet. He didn't have the more experienced pilots. What he did have was the conviction that knowing what the enemy planned was more decisive than matching their numbers. So he set the trap. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, on the other hand, built Japan's offensive plan on an opposite principle: shock defeats caution. Japan believed surprise would neutralize American resistance. They believed aggressive movement would disorient the U.S. Navy. They believed their own momentum, earned through 6 months of victories, would carry them through Midway as well. Both men made assumptions. Only one assumption aligned with reality. Japan believed its plan was invisible. America knew the plan in advance. Japan believed it controlled the tempo. America set the tempo from the moment it ambushed the fleet. Japan believed its pilots were unmatched. America didn't try to match them. it tried to exhaust them. Japan believed carriers were invincible while striking. America caught them while rearming. Every angle, human, tactical, strategic, psychological, converged into the same vulnerability. Japan never realized its true enemy wasn't the American fleet. It was the information war it had already lost. And in a few minutes, that invisible defeat would become a visible catastrophe. The decisive moment of Midway didn't unfold slowly. It snapped into place all at once, almost violently, around 10:20 a.m., when the sky above the Japanese fleet turned from empty blue to a killing ground. Let's rewind to the minutes before it happened. American torpedo squadrons had been torn apart. Squadron 8 wiped out, Squadron 6 mauled, Squadron 3 scattered and burning. From the surface, Japan seemed untouchable. 0 fighters circled low, confident after shredding wave after wave of slow-moving devastators. Pilots aboard the Japanese carriers were preparing for the second strike. Bombs were stacked on the decks. Fuel lines stretched across the planks. Aircraft were being shuffled like pieces on a chessboard, hurried, exposed, irreplaceable. This should have been the moment the codebreakers struck its final, decisive blow. Instead, the dive bombers arrived. They came out of the sun, not because of a dramatic plan, but because the navigational mistakes earlier in the morning had pushed them slightly off course. Commander Wade McCluskey's group from Enterprise was nearly out of fuel when he spotted a thin, almost invisible wake on the surface of the ocean. A lone Japanese destroyer, Arashi, was sprinting at full speed to rejoin the fleet after pursuing an American submarine. McCluskey made a choice: follow the wake, trust instinct over doctrine. It was a small decision, almost a footnote, but it's the reason he found the Japanese carriers at the exact minute they were least able to defend themselves. 10:20 a.m. The sky opens. From 14,000 feet up, the Japanese fleet looked like a set of moving targets in a shooting gallery. Carriers turning into the wind, destroyers carving arcs of white water, Zeros pulled to sea level, entirely unaware of the danger above. The dive bomber squadrons split. Enterprise's Bombing 6 locked onto Kaga. Enterprise's Scouting 6 aimed for Akagi. Yorktown's Bombing 3 targeted Soryu. 3 carriers, 3 attack angles, 1 moment of perfect exposure. And then the dauntless pilots tipped forward. A dive bomber's descent isn't graceful. The cockpit shakes. Gravity drags the pilot downward. Airspeed spikes past 250, 300, 350 miles per hour. The ocean rushes upward. The target, a ship trying to weave through chaos, must be tracked through a falling, vibrating gun sight. Down they came. Kaga filled the pilot's view first. Her flight deck was crowded with fuel trucks, armed aircraft, and open munitions. The first American bombs struck the forward area. A second tore into the midsection. A third hit near the stern. Fires erupted instantly, white-hot, devouring everything they touched. Fuel lines burst. Aircraft detonated where they sat. A sheet of flame rolled across the deck, swallowing every sailor who couldn't move fast enough. Kaga was dying within seconds. Next was Akagi. A single bomb, just one, landed near the aft elevator, penetrating into the upper hangar. But it hit the worst possible place at the worst possible time. Fuel vapors ignited. The explosion raced through the ship's interior, turning compartments into furnaces. Akagi's captain begged Nagumo to abandon ship. The flagship of the codebreakers was finished from one perfectly placed bomb. Soryu was hit almost simultaneously by Yorktown's dive bombers. 3 direct hits, 3 eruptions, 3 hangars engulfed. Her crew fought the fires, but the flames outran them. Within minutes, Soryu became a drifting inferno. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, the core of the strongest naval strike force on the planet, were burning so violently that the smoke could be seen for miles. 5 minutes. That's all it took to rewrite naval warfare. Japan's shock. A fleet blindsided. On the bridges of the surviving ships, officers stared at the destruction with disbelief. Japan's doctrine had promised superiority through speed and coordination. Yet here they were, paralyzed, decks ruined, aircraft destroyed before they could even launch. This wasn't a lucky strike. This was the full convergence of every angle the battle had built up. The intelligence trap, the torpedo squadron's sacrifice, Nagumo's delayed rearm, American dive bomber discipline, and the Japanese assumption that surprise belonged only to them. For the first time in the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced an attack they didn't see coming and couldn't counter. But the battle wasn't over. One carrier remained, Hiryu, the lone survivor of Japan's carrier force, the last ship with aircraft ready to strike, and she was about to deliver her counterblow. Hiryu stood alone, and that changed the psychology of the fight. Instead of collapsing, her crew locked into a razor-sharp focus that only veteran aviators carry. They weren't thinking about the 3 burning carriers. They weren't thinking about the scale of the disaster. They were thinking about one thing: strike back immediately. Hiryu launched her first wave fast, faster than any American commander expected was still possible. These pilots were Japan's best, hardened by months of combat. As they climbed, they saw the smoke columns rising from their fleet and understood the stakes. If they didn't sink an American carrier, the entire operation was finished. They found Yorktown first. Yorktown had been hit at Coral Sea, repaired in 72 frantic hours, and sent straight back into combat. Her crew was exhausted but disciplined. Spotters saw the incoming formation almost immediately. General quarters sounded. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. But Hiryu's dive bombers broke through. 3 bombs smashed into Yorktown. One tore through the flight deck. One detonated deep inside the ship. One crippled engineering spaces. Fires spread. The ship slowed. Smoke drifted across the water. To many observers, Yorktown looked mortally wounded. But this crew refused to sink. Damage control teams moved with almost mechanical precision. Fires were isolated, flooding contained, engines restarted. Within an hour, Yorktown was back under power, listing but alive. Pilots who believed their home deck was gone returned to find her still floating. It was a fleeting victory. Hiryu launched her second strike, this time torpedo bombers. Yorktown's gunners tore into them. But a few broke through, launching torpedoes that struck the wounded carrier from her vulnerable side. The impact rolled her violently. Power failed. The ship came to a halt. Captain Buckmaster finally gave the order to abandon ship. Yorktown had absorbed 2 full strikes that were meant to destroy 2 different carriers. In doing so, she saved Enterprise and Hornet from the same fate. She didn't sink because she was weak. She sank because she stood alone against the full fury of Japan's last operational carrier. Yorktown's distress didn't go unnoticed. American scouts followed the attack planes back along their return path, a subtle, often ignored detail that made the final strike possible. By late afternoon, Enterprise and Hornet had the coordinates. This time, the dive bombers weren't lost. They weren't scattered. They weren't late. They flew with the cold clarity of men who knew the outcome now depended on finishing what had been started in the morning. They found Hiryu toward sunset, maneuvering alone, her decks cleared, her crew preparing for yet another launch cycle. She was still fighting, still composed, still committed to striking again. But she was out of time. The dauntless squadrons dove through fading light. Bombs smashed into her deck. One explosion blossomed beneath the island's structure. Another ruptured the hangar. Fire spread through the ship's interior so quickly the crew could barely make it to stations. Hiryu burned through the night, finally scuttled by her escorts the next morning. Japan's carrier force, the most feared naval formation on Earth, was gone. Not damaged, not dented, erased. 4 carriers sunk. Hundreds of veteran aviators lost. Doctrines shattered. Momentum reversed. The Pacific War did not end at Midway, but the shape of the war, the direction of it, changed permanently in these few hours. Before Midway, Japan dictated the tempo. After Midway, Japan reacted to the tempo set by the United States. This was the moment the initiative changed hands. This was the moment the empire began to retreat. And now, the question the world faced was simple. What would the cost be to push Japan all the way back across the Pacific? When the smoke cleared over the Pacific, the ocean looked strangely calm, almost indifferent to the ruins floating on its surface. Midway wasn't a long battle. It wasn't a drawn-out siege. It was a single, violent pivot in the war where both sides walked away changed in ways they didn't yet understand. For the Americans, the victory came with a cost that can't be softened. Torpedo Squadron 8 lost nearly every man. Other squadrons were torn apart in attacks that achieved nothing tactical, but everything necessary. The men who survived the dive-bombing runs returned to their carriers exhausted and shaken, knowing their success had been built on the sacrifice of those who never came back. On the Japanese side, the loss was deeper than the ships themselves. The Pacific didn't just swallow steel, it swallowed Japan's most experienced naval aviators. These pilots weren't replaceable. They were the product of years of training and the hard lessons of earlier campaigns. Their disappearance hollowed out the core of Japan's offensive strength. Every battle after Midway suffered from that absence. And the sailors trapped aboard the burning carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, left behind stories that rarely find their way into documentaries. Men fighting fires with towels and buckets. Others blinded by smoke stumbling through collapsing passageways. Entire divisions sealed off in desperate attempts to contain the flames. Midway wasn't just a tactical defeat for Japan. It was a human catastrophe. Before Midway, Japan expanded in every direction. Its momentum seemed unstoppable. After Midway, that momentum slowed. Not immediately, not obviously, but decisively. 4 fleet carriers represented more than military power. They represented Japan's ability to project force across the Pacific. Without them, the empire's strategic reach began to shrink. Japan still had ships. Japan still had planes. But Japan no longer had time. The industrial advantage of the United States, factories, steel, manpower, was now set against an enemy that had just suffered the heaviest single-day carrier loss in history. America could replace its ships. Japan couldn't replace its pilots. The balance didn't shift gradually. It shifted in one afternoon. For the United States, Midway wasn't just a victory. It was proof, tangible, undeniable proof that the Pacific War could be won. The idea that the Imperial Navy was untouchable evaporated. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet returned home as symbols of a new reality. The U.S. Navy could stand toe-to-toe with Japan and emerge stronger. Confidence didn't replace caution, but it changed the tone of every plan that came after. Guadalcanal, the Central Pacific Drive, the island-hopping strategy. Everything was now built on the understanding that the initiative had shifted westward. Nimitz understood what Midway truly represented, the triumph of information over mass. The codebreakers who identified AF as Midway weren't just supporting the Navy, they were reshaping the war itself. Midway validated a new era of warfare where intelligence didn't just inform decisions, it made them. The lesson wasn't lost on Japan. Unfortunately for them, it was a lesson learned too late. Here's the part people often miss. Midway didn't end Japan's ability to fight. The empire remained dangerous. Its army was intact. Its navy still had battleships, cruisers, and smaller carriers. Its defensive perimeter stretched thousands of miles. The Pacific War would grind on for 3 more brutal years. But the shape of those years was now fixed. Japan would fight defensively. America would advance. The long, punishing arc of the conflict, the island battles, the attrition, the tightening noose, all trace back to the moment 4 Japanese carriers vanished into smoke and fire. This is where the truth settles. Midway wasn't just the day Japan lost. It was the day America stopped losing. If you love real World War II stories that sound unbelievable but actually happened, subscribe for more. Because after Midway, Japan wasn't just losing ships, it was running out of time. Midway leaves a quiet echo in history, the kind that sits beneath the noise of victory and defeat. When you strip away the smoke and strategy, you're left with a simple truth. The battle was shaped by people who made decisions in moments that didn't feel heroic at the time. A codebreaker in a cramped room, choosing to test a theory. A pilot following a faint wake across an empty ocean. Sailors fighting fires they knew they couldn't outrun. None of them saw the larger picture. They just acted under pressure in the seconds they were given. And those seconds changed everything. The carriers that rolled and burned on June 4th didn't just sink into the Pacific. They pulled the old certainty of the war down with them. After Midway, the conflict shifted from fear to possibility, from reaction to resolve. Nations don't often get days that redefine their future in a handful of minutes. But this was one of them. History remembers the explosions. It remembers the victory. What it rarely remembers is how fragile the moment truly was. A handful of choices, a sliver of time, a battle that could have gone either way, and the world that followed because it didn't.